Good evening to our viewers around the world, and welcome to our weekly CJL Fireside Chat, where we have hosted many extraordinary personalities, inspirational leaders from around the world. Tonight, we are privileged and honored to have with us a great individual. Her name is Eva Schloss, MBE, and really, truly, a survivor of one of the greatest tragedies in our history, but as the prophets say, an ember saved from the fire. Eva was born in May 1929, is an Australian English Holocaust survivor and stepdaughter of Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank. Schloss speaks widely of her family's experiences during the Holocaust and is also a participant of the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive project to record video answers to be used as educational tools for students and general population around the world. Eva has also written a number of incredible books detailing these experiences. Amongst them is Eva's Story, The Promise, After Auschwitz, and Hell and Back. I know from personal experience she has spoken all around the globe, literally to hundreds of schools, towns, cities in America, the Far East, and Europe, and has had an incredible, profound, sometimes transformational impact on thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young and old alike. It is our pleasure, Eva. It is an honor to have you with us tonight. And as I mentioned before, although the Holocaust was one of the greatest tragedies to befall humanity, you as a survivor of that ordeal, because of hope, you are indeed a demonstration of the great miracles of history. It is our pleasure and honor also to have with us tonight our interviewer, who's done an incredible job last night, a good friend of the Center for Jewish Life. May I introduce you to our interviewer tonight, Osvaldo Pereira.
Thank you, Yosef. And thank you very much, Eva, for making yourself available for this conversation. A very, very important talk, given everything that's happening in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure for me to work with you again.
If I could ask you, just maybe to set the stage for our conversation, to talk a little bit about your childhood. You were born in one of the great capitals of the world, in Vienna, which is really the flower of European civilization, and a very cosmopolitan city, and one that historically had been very liberal and embracing of Jews. It's the home of Alfred Adler, of Mahler, Wittgenstein, Freud, so many Jewish luminaries. What was it like for you growing up in Vienna, and were you made to feel self-conscious about being Jewish? Did you feel yourself different?
Well, I was born in 1929 in Vienna. So after the terrible First World War, things had settled down again. And we had a big Jewish family. And we were not very religious. But in Austria, you have to have at school religious education. So every Jewish child in school was called out. And we had twice a week Jewish education in a different classroom. And then we went back, and all the other children were mainly Catholics, of course, and that was accepted. So everybody knew who was a Jew and who was Catholic, and we played together, and Austria is a beautiful country scenery-wise, with mountains and lakes, and I really took to that. My father was as well great into sport, so every weekend we went on tour into the mountains or on the lakes, and I had an older brother and cousins, and it was really idyllic. And unfortunately, of course, in Germany, we heard already what was happening to the Jewish people, but Austria didn't really want to join Hitler, the Germans. But unfortunately, Hitler didn't wait for any election. There was supposed to be an election, and he didn't wait. And in 1938, the Nazi army with Hitler in front just rolled into Austria. And the Austrians changed from other. Suddenly they had all swastika flags all over the place, and Heil Hitler stood in the street. And my first experience of anti-Semitism was the next day, when I usually on my way home, I was dropped in at my Catholic friend, which was my best friend. And when the mother saw me, I could see she looked very, very cross. And when I came there, she said, "We never want to see you here again." And she slammed the door in my face. I was really in shock. I went home crying. I don't a quarrel. What happened? And my mother said, "Well, for Jewish people now, life is going to be quite different and very difficult." My brother, after a couple of days, he was 12 years old, he came home, his clothes were torn, his face was full of blood, and when my parents questioned, he just watched, let it happen. So you can imagine it was a big, big shock. And my father was very, very obviously prepared. You know, at that time, of course, there was no television, there was radio, but it wasn't something popular. So we had, as children, we had no idea what was going on in the world. So my father obviously had prepared when something like this might happen, and he left immediately to Holland. He had a shoe factory which he had inherited from his parents, and he had business with the Netherlands. So he knew already where he was going to go. And he said, "As soon as I'm settled, I'm going to let you come as well." But things had changed. So it took a few weeks, or perhaps even a few months, I don't know exactly. And by that time, when we wanted to follow my father, most of Europe had closed borders for Jewish refugees. Of course, in Germany, they had already taken in quite a few refugees earlier, but in 1938, 39, they didn't want any more Jewish refugees. So eventually we heard we could go illegally over the border to Belgium, and that is what we did. I think you want the second question. I think you asked me about Belgium and Holland.
Yes, I think yes. You mentioned you obviously had a very happy childhood.
Yeah, well,
and you became a refugee and an illegal immigrant at the age of 9, it sounds like. What was that like then, moving to Belgium?
That's right. It was terrible. It was really a complete shock to me. First of all, I didn't speak French. So I was put in school. We had, of course, no money Belgium too, because you were not allowed to take anything out with you, just a few clothes. And so we lived in a little boarding house. We had 2 rooms, little rooms, one for my mother and when my father visited in weekends, and one for my brother and and me. And my mother had no household, so we ate there in a pension. And people really thought because we didn't speak the language, we had come from the moon or something. So it was really, really very unpleasant. And the children too, you know, they didn't speak to me, they didn't take any notice, they didn't try to make friends. Very, very unfriendly. It was really an enormous shock to my system. But you know, children get used to it, and I started to learn the language, and eventually I made a few friends. One was a Jewish girl, even in the class, and it was my birthday, my 10th birthday, and in Vienna I had always lovely birthday parties, and I asked the lady from the boarding house if I could invite a few friends, and she said, yes, 5 girls you can ask. And on the day of the birthday, all those girls had a letter from the parents that they can't come to my party. I was devastated. Again, when I was at school and I went home crying, and I said, I really don't understand that. And my mother said, well, Jewish refugees are just not popular. They just don't want their children to mix with us. Holland was, thank God, quite different. So the war had started because Hitler went into Poland and Britain and France declared war. And my father had tried desperately to get a visa for us. And eventually we got a visiting visa during the war already, February 1940, visit my father. He had taken a furnished apartment in an area in Amsterdam South, and Merwedeplein, where some German refugee had moved to as well. And the Dutch were very, very friendly. The children all wanted to know where I came from, um, how Austria looks, because Holland is very flat. And when I said mountain, they couldn't imagine how that looks. And I became quite popular, and I got a bicycle. And they all said, you look like a Dutch little girl. I was blue. And on this square lived, as I say, some other Jewish families. And one day, other girl came to me, introduced herself. Her name was Anne Frank. And we became friends. She was just 1 month old, younger than me. But she went to the local Montessori school. I went to the local ordinary school. But after school, all the children of this neighborhood came to play on this open square. And so it was really very, very nice, very pleasant. My brother, he was a young musician already. He was just 15, but he could play piano. And in this rented apartment was a big piano. And he had got a guitar and an accordion. And he made a little band with his friends. So life was very, very good, but very short-lived, because the Nazi invaded in May 1940.
And very quickly after that, you were always running one step ahead of disaster, it seems. You fled Austria to go to Belgium, and then when the war started, Belgium to Holland. And shortly after arriving in Holland, the Nazi invasion occurred and you were forced with your family to go into hiding. Can you describe a little bit about what that was like?
Right. Well, 2 years we were still free, and measures against Jewish people were taken, but it was more a nuisance than life-threatening. But slowly, those measures became more strict, like we had to wear a yellow star, so everybody would recognize you if you were in the street, that you were a Jew. And then we had to leave our schools and go to Jewish schools. By itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But the Nazis came with trucks, told the youngsters to go on the truck, and in the evenings the parents waited for the children to come home, and they never turned up. They went to the police. Even the Nazi police didn't get any answer. So children were never ever seen again. Only after the war we heard that they were sent to Mauthausen, at the time already a horrific Austrian death camp, where they were thrown from the cliffs. So you can imagine just disappearing was very, very bad. So then, after 2 years, about 10,000 young people, my brother included, he was 16, and Anne's sister Margot, and many of their friends, but as well early 20s, got a call-up notice to come and work in Germany, in German factories. Well, by that time, practically all the Jews in Germany had been picked up and sent to ghettos and camps. So why on earth should they invite Jewish youngsters to come again to Germany? So many parents were very suspicious of that. And my father called us together one evening and he said, Heinz, you're not going, but we're going to go into hiding. And I said, hiding? What do you mean? Adults don't hide. And my father explained, we have to disappear so that Heinz won't be arrested. And so I found some wonderful people. It was called Resistance, who offer their homes for us to stay safe. But you know, the apartments in Amsterdam and Holland in general are very small, and he couldn't find a family who wanted to take in 4 people. So we have to split up. So he said, I will go with mother and Heinz will go with him. And I started to cry. I was very, very attached to my brother and my father, and I didn't want to be separated again. And my father explained, if we're in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. So survive. I had just turned 13 and I realized it might be a matter of life and death. And that was pretty scary. So we separated, we went on the morning when they were supposed to go somewhere else to this new address. And welcome. We had tiny little rooms. We had not much space. The woman was a teacher and she went out to work in daytime. So she said, while I'm away, you're not allowed to make any sound because neighbors might hear. They might think they're burglars and call the police. So we had to sit still all the time from morning till evening, till the people came home again. My mother prepared a meal. We had our potty next to it, and there we sat. I was, as I told you, a very lively, active child. I found it very at the time. I didn't know what to do with myself. So the days dragged on and on and on. And the nights were horrific because the Nazis wanted to look for those people who had not turned up, and they made house searches. 7 different ones. The resistance people made a hiding place within the hiding place in a false partition under the floorboard. And so at night when this knock came, we quickly had to go there. So you can imagine we couldn't sleep, we were nervous, and so were our hosts. So we had to move about 7 times in the 2 years we were in hiding. The same with my father and brother. After 2 years, we had just moved to a different address. My father phoned my mother. He was in the country at the time with Heinz, and said the woman where they were staying is blackmailing them for more money. Well, if you don't earn, of course, our capital had run out, and he said, if the war still lasts long, he's going to throw us out. Please find a new hiding place. Eventually, a Dutch nurse came forward because my mother was in touch with the resistance. And said she knows a safe place in Amsterdam. So my father and brother escaped that night from this house and were received at the station by this nurse, a very nice home. And as I had been so very, very miserable all the time, my mother and me occasionally visit my father and brother. And this new address was very near where we were. So on the Sunday when they moved in there, we went to visit them. And were very satisfied. We went home satisfied. They were in a nice place, not far from us. So perhaps we can visit more often, see each other. And on Tuesday, it was my 15th birthday, and we sat down to breakfast, and there was a knock on the door, which daytime was always safe, and opened the door, and the Nazis stormed in and went straight for my mother and me and took us away. You can imagine, not a very nice birthday.
And Eva,
and we were arrested and taken to the headquarters and interrogated, and I was beaten, and they threatened me if I don't tell who had helped us, where we had got our ration cards, all kinds of questions. And I must say, I was completely in shock. I just lost my speech. I didn't say anything. So they told me they would threaten, they would kill my brother. So I realized they were arrested as well. And eventually they let us go, and I met my father, brother, and my mother.
now you were betrayed by a member of the resistance, and I wanted to ask you your impressions of the Dutch at this time and these people.
Well, we thought she was resistant. Yeah.
There were some people who were absolutely heroic.
Well, in 1944.
Sorry.
Yeah, there was a big resistance movement in all the occupied countries. But in 1942, 44, because it was 1944, 2 years, it really looked that as if Germany was going to win. So many, many people had become Nazis, thinking when the war and Hitler is a victor, they will get good jobs, good positions. And sometimes the presidents are members of the resistance, so they could spy for the Nazis. So, and actually the Dutch have a good name through Anne Frank story, but unfortunately they were not so good. There were many, many, many people betrayed. In proportion, the most Jews from all the countries, even Poland and Germany, there was the biggest amount of Jews who were betrayed and deported and killed, of course.
This happened, your arrest happened, as you mentioned, on your 15th birthday. And you experienced a level of brutality in that day that you had never experienced before. This was a real turning point in your life. This, I think, was the first time you were exposed to such violence and direct brutality. How did you make sense of it?
Well, we knew what was going on because the death camps and concentration camp was no secret to the world. In Holland, where we were in hiding, you could listen to the BBC, and they told about the 300 camps and death camps in Germany and Poland, and they even mentioned in Auschwitz and other camps where Jewish people were systematically being gassed. But a lot of people thought Germany, they are, gassing people. But they didn't. But actually, it was the truth. So we knew when we were arrested, probably killed. So You can imagine, we were for a very short time in a holding camp, and then we were put on transport. Again, most people know by now, not proper trains, but I call it a cattle truck. It could be for animals, or it could be like a container, just big metal wagons with just a little slit of a window, iron door which were locked, nothing in it, board, floorboards, and nowhere to sit, no nothing, and two buckets, one for drinking water and toilet facilities. Buckets for about 80 people. Once a day it was changed, and once a day they threw big chunks of bread in, like you would feed wild animals. So that was already an experience which I will never ever forget. The only good thing was at the time that we were still together as a family. And my father, with tears in his eyes, apologized to us that he couldn't protect us anymore. He gave us all kind of advice how we should live if we are in a camp, help each other, and clean, hygienic, and things like that. Later, I had to smile because it was so completely impossible. And my brother, he was just 16 years old. He was, as I say, he was very artistic and so very, very sensitive. He was petrified. Really, he could hardly breathe. He was in such a shock. I and my father and my mother had still sort of hope, but he was really very, very, very afraid of dying. And while he was in hiding, I told you he was a musician, but of course he couldn't make any music. He had to be quiet. He started to paint, and he created some amazing artwork. And more or less the last conversation I had with him was he told me in the cattle truck that before they fled from this woman who blackmailed them, the note on it, this belongs to Heinz and Erich Geiringer, and after the war he's coming to pick it. Because when he fled from this house, he thought he goes to it and the war will soon end and he will be able to be free. But once we were betrayed, I think he gave up all hope.
And later, Eva, you rescued your brother's paintings after the war. You were able to find them.
And then, of course, we ended up in Auschwitz. Are you connected?
I am. Can you tell us a little bit about what the camps were like?
I don't hear you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences in the camps?
Right,
what they were like?
Yes, we have some. That was when Otto Frank came and got the diary from Anne. That was, I'd forgotten about the painting, but must get these paintings. And we, what? By what? Say again? In the camp. Well, of course, at the time it, there was this, but he wasn't there, of course, to help people when they're ill, but he was called Dr. Death. He decided who was going to live and who was going to die. So at arrival, the first thing, of course, first we were separated, men and women, to different parts. Auschwitz was a huge area with many camps. There was Auschwitz, a men camp. There was Birkenau, a women camp. Then there was another camp called Monoway, and a few different camps where people worked as well. And but so the men walked to Auschwitz, and we went Birkenau. Sometimes this train went to Birkenau, and it's just walking distance. And so the first selection took place. But all the children, all the older people, babies, toddlers, all went to the wrong side. I was only 15. I was not very tall and pale, of course. But miracle what happened. But I had just a summer dress I was arrested in. The holding camp, some good people gave my mother some clothes, a hat and a coat. And my mother gave me this. She said, wear it. And Angela looked at me just a fraction of a second. So from our transport, we were over 100 children. Only 6 survived. But of course, at the time, I didn't know. But so you can imagine it was a big shock. And for mothers who had lost their children, or young people who had lost their parents, it was of course terrible. Then we were herded into the camp in a huge hall. And next command was undressed completely naked. And the SS young guards in the 20s poked their guns at us, laughing at our naked embarrassment. Then all our hair was shaved, and then we were told, you are not armed, you get a number like a cattle, and if ever we want you, we are going to call you out by your number, not by your name. So when all this happened, we were herded out naked, and we were given one garment, no underwear, and the shoes, 2 shoes, never of course a pair. That was herded like sheep, always quick. People lost already their shoes, and the barrack, I've seen photos, bunks 3 high, wood, nothing in it at all. And that is where 8 people had to sleep. So like sardines. We slept like sardines. When one turned, we all had to turn in the mug of liquid. That was which the next day. So where do you put it? Forget, you had nowhere to put anything. So you slept, you put the bread under your head. But not in the beginning, but a bit later, when people were so hungry, when you slept and the person next to you was still waking up, they just ate the bread from under your body. And so you woke up and your food was gone. You know, people ask, did you have big friendships? Did you look after each other? In the beginning, yes. But after a while, you were so desperate, so starving, so exhausted, that the only way to stay alive was just to look after yourself. And that was part of the dehumanization what the Germans really wanted to do. They wanted to create wild animals out of us. And I must say, unfortunately, most people really didn't care about other people, and it was very, very tragic. The next terrible, terrible thing was that we were, of course, working from early morning to late lice, and the washing was completely impossible, no chance to ever wash. And so once a week, usually we were going to a shower and we were deloused. And that might have been already October, I think. Of course, you didn't know, you only went by the season. It was already pretty cool. And we come out of the shower, naked, of course, and there stood Mengele, and a select was taking place. From time to time that happened. And you had to turn around in front of him, and he judged if you were still able to work or not. So I passed, and my mother, who was very tall and like every mother would have done, very often she gave me her part of her bread, and she had become really very, very thin. She was anyway a very slim lady. And he looked at her, then to the side. With 40 also women from our Dutch transport, those naked women walked outside going to be guests. I still tried to run to her to say goodbye, but the couple beat me with a stick over the back and separated me. And I thought I'd lost my mother. You know, and I had no idea if my father is alive, if my brother is alive. That became for me the hardest time, because I had always had hope, well, the war won't last long anymore and we will be together again. But losing my mother was, of course, it became winter, and it was there was high snow. Sometimes I lost my shoes. I was barefoot. I got frostbite on my feet, open toes, blood that got infected. I would have lost my feet eventually. And I was working inside, making plats, and I thought I was on the point of giving up. And then another miracle happened. I went to outside, and I thought, oh, well, now that's it. And I go outside, and there was my father standing with an SS man. You know, never a man came from the women's camp to us, and how he would know where I was, till this day I don't know it. And of course, we embraced, and then came the question, where is Mutti, your mum? And I burst into tears, and then I went that she has been gassed. And again I saw my father crumple in front of my eyes. You know, that was for him a terrible news to accept. I saw him anymore. To say other, and I had, of course, you know, I have to tell only a little bit. We had met a cousin in the camp, which was as well a miracle, and she worked with Mengele in the hospital, and she had saved my mother's life. Mengele went up to look at her again and put her back to the living. But it was a more complicated story. But anyway, the Russians were approaching to evacuate the camp. Every day, barracks were emptied and people disappeared. We had no idea what happened to those people, if they were killed or if they went somewhere. But there were not many, and as well, many SS people left as well. You know, there was A, B, C camp, all separated by gates and electrified barbed wire, but sometimes the gates were open, and I walk, and sometimes we went to work, sometimes there was no work, so I walked again around, seeing if I can find somebody I knew, or if I could find some food or whatever. And some Dutch people who were also part of the camp from our transport came and said, Eva, we have seen your mother. She's alive. Life, she was selected. She said, no, we have seen her. And you try to go to this part of the camp. So in a few days, again, the gates were open and I ran out and I went to this D camp. We were in B camp. And indeed, my mother was there. So, you know, it's all a much longer story. I would have hours to talk it in details, but it's all in my book. You have read it. It's, you know, so many miracles happened to me. And I would certainly, if I wouldn't have had my father, if I wouldn't have found my mother, I would certainly not be able to sit here. I would not have made it.
You mentioned these miracles. I mean, and yeah. It truly is miraculous that your mother's long lost cousin was a nurse.
So what is your next question? I know you have quite a few.
You said in your book.
You want to ask me your next question?
Yes. You mentioned miracles that kept you alive.
You're not connected. Oh dear.
You mentioned a series of miracles that basically kept you alive against all odds. How do you make sense of these miracles? You know, you mentioned that when you left the camps, you were an atheist.
But that was, of course, miraculous. Yeah. What did I say? Yeah. Yeah, well, that is already 3, 4, you know. Because would be reunited. But when we got back to Holland, and you know, was chaos there. The Dutch had suffered a lot, and every day people came from journalists. We went around to fasten my brother by name, sometimes with a photo, and eventually, after we came back in June, we traveled all the way with the Russians till Odessa, and then the long way through the Mediterranean. So it took us a long time to get back to where we wanted to end up. And so, you know, we hoped, we were full of hope. So was Otto Frank, that the family had still survived. Not with any feeling, saying to my mother, your husband, Erich Geringer, and your son, Heinz Geringer, with even the date of birth, perished in Mauthausen, that was this terrible Austrian death camp, several days camp, or that separated for me, you know. And I had always counted that we would be reunited. So I became completely depressed, hating everybody, and I just couldn't cope with life. I had written, and my mother gave me that many years later, a little note where I wrote, it's dated 1st of January 1946. Life without my father and my brother is completely useless to me. I would like to commit suicide. So can you imagine to survive Auschwitz and then wanted to kill yourself? I was extremely depressed, and the peculiar thing, I was very, very close to my mother. We really loved each other, but you know, it was too painful. So we pretended, oh, it's okay, but we really, really were completely. My mother too. Her mother saw lots of those letters where my mother writes, she's desperate. She did some homework. She was trying to make some belts to earn some money. And I cry and I said, look what has become of my life. I'm a widow. I've lost my son. I've got a daughter who doesn't want to live, who's so miserable. And I am miserable. And she started to cry. And I come home from school and I sing and whistle. It takes her tears away and starts to sing and pretending that she's happy and I pretend I'm happy. We didn't talk how we were both unhappy. I'm still puzzled why we didn't talk about it and comforting each other. But obviously that was not possible. And Otto Frank, he heard as well, of course, that his whole family had perished. He lost his news and he looked like a ghost. And after he left, my mother said, how can this man carry on with his life? And a few days later, he came again with a little parcel on his arm, and it was and the will to live again. He started to read a few sentences, but he always burst into tears, and it was too emotional. And it took him 3 weeks to read it, and he was so proud of it. He knew she had written, but he had no idea what. So he published it, of course, eventually. It was difficult for him because he should publish it, but everybody advised him, it's such a valued document, he really has to publish it. And under the floorboard, and that was the only thing we had from Heinz. And my father actually painted as well. And a few years ago, I donated them to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam so that many, many people can see it and learn who he was. And I wrote another book, The Promise, which is the promise of when Heinz was 12 years old. He asked my father, I'm afraid of dying, what would happen? And my father said, well, of course, we all have to die, but whatever you have done in your life, somebody will remember. So he had to accept this, I promise you this. And so I wrote a book, his life, what a wonderful young man he lived as well. He wrote wonderful poetry. In his short life, he has achieved really quite a bit. And so there's a play about us as well. And so, you know, his life is not forgotten. But there are still millions of other Jewish children where sometimes one doesn't even know their name. So, this Holocaust was really the biggest tragedy we Jews have ever experienced. We have gone through many I can't think of the name. Jewish people have been persecuted through centuries, but certainly the worst which could ever have happened to us.
And Eva, how did you climb out then from this darkness and depression? How did you find the will?
I think you have a few more questions. That again.
How did you climb out of this grief and this depression following the loss of your family to rebuild your life?
Doesn't connect, huh? Can you? Well, as I say, I was of course very, very depressed. I had to go back to school, which Otto Frank said as well. A good education, nobody can take that away. That is very important. So I did, but I didn't make friends with my classmates. But it was Otto Frank who he came very often. He was lonely. My mother was lonely, so he came. My mother cooked a meal for us, and so became very book translated, and so she advised. So they worked a bit together, and Otto said to me, when you hate a person, the people you hate, Nazis won't suffer from your hate, but you became an unhappy person. And that was true. And Otto gave me his Leica because he said, I have no family anymore. I'm never going to take pictures. He was a good photographer. He took many, many pictures of his children. So, and then when I finished school, he found me a job in London as an apprentice in a photographic studio for a year. And you ask me, how could you leave your mother? But, my mother was quite often for a meal, and they went together to form a new synagogue and did things together. So I knew she would be looked after by Otto. So I knew she wasn't so lonely. And so I went to England for a year, and I became an apprentice here. And England was still, after that was in 1951, I was food rationing. It was really, really very, very difficult again. And people, as English people, didn't really like foreigners, especially German-speaking foreigners. That was actually very, very difficult to make friends. So, but I lived in a little boarding house, and there was a Jewish boy who had come from Israel to study economics, and we became friends, and we went for walks. And after 6 months, he said to me, Eva, I've fallen in love with you. And once I'm finished my studies, we can get married and start a new life and go back to Israel. And I said, no, thank you, because I've got a widowed mother in Amsterdam, and when the year is over, I'm going to go back there. You see, I really was never intending to leave her for any length of time. I was kept a bit an eye on me, and he had some business here, came to visit, and I told him, this young man has asked me to marry him, but of course I'm going back to Holland, and I'm not going to send me have fallen in love as well. And once you get married, we like to get married. So I went back to this young man and said, you can now? And he was very happy. And we went the next year we went to Amsterdam to get married, and my mother asked him not to take me to Israel, because at that time, it was difficult to reach it, was expensive, and you had to go a week on a boat, there was no flying yet, so we decided we would stay in England. And Otto and my mother got married a year later, and they were married for 27 years, longer than they were married with their first spouses. And I've never seen a happier couple than those two. So it ended up also quite, relatively happy to me. And I have 3 children, 3 daughters, never told them. Of course, they knew about Anne. That became Otto was their grandfather. So there was always history.
I think we're having some connectivity issues.
To hear what is.
Okay. Yes, good evening. Osvaldo, as you said, I think we're having some connectivity issues. Yeah, we're having some connectivity issues. So we'll just wait a few moments to see if she can get back. It is 9:10. So anyway, but I'll just say a few words at this stage, and perhaps Eva can join us again. But we are coming towards the end of the interview, and first of all, I want to thank Osvaldo for a wonderful job in preparing this framework and these insightful, probing questions that have brought out the best, I think we would all agree, in one of the most incredible women. All survivors were incredible. These were 1 in 1,000 who survived through some of the most difficult ordeals known to mankind. A young girl who suffers, who's humiliated, who's caught from the anguish and the experiences that she has to live with for the rest of her life. And this is really what the mystics call transforming the darkness into light. And I think this is something that is a very particularly Jewish trait. It is something that we have the ability to do. And, when we all go through difficulties in our lives, as we all do, we can look back and look up to people like Eva and other Holocaust survivors and derive tremendous inspiration from their story. There's a famous verse authored by King Solomon who says, "And the living shall take it to heart." And I think in this case, these are the witnesses who have witnessed one of the most difficult, darkest, tragic moments in Jewish history. And they're telling the story, and the story is of hope, the story is of faith, the story is of love, the story is of compassion. And I think we should look more carefully and closely to these stories and certainly gain perspective in our own lives during these challenging times that we are in now, but certainly nothing in comparison to what these incredible people went through. So, Osvaldo, if I can just come to you at this stage, and I think we will close. We were supposed to in 5 minutes anyway. And just Osvaldo, again, thanks again for that incredible interview. It was difficult under the circumstances. There was a difficult connection there, but we made the most of it. So, Osvaldo, if you can come in with your thoughts on Eva.
So I just want to tell everyone, look, we had some connectivity issues. Eva is 91 years old, and people should realize she spent the last decades of her life, over the last decades, traveling more or less continuously, and she's redoubled those efforts in recent times. I know she's traveled all around the world, including very recently to California, where I'm from, because the world doesn't seem to learn its lessons. There were children at a very prestigious private school in an upscale part of the state. So by no means people who were cut off from education, who were giving the Hitler salute. And we see now videos of people embracing extremism again. And I asked her what, I had a chance to speak with her this weekend, just in preparation, and she said many things, but a couple of things that struck out in my mind that came out in her memoirs. And she said that basically she's forgiven God. She has a strong faith in God, an abiding faith in God. And she wrote, I questioned whether it was God's responsibility the death camps existed, and I decided no, it's our responsibility. God gave us free will, and it is up to us to choose between good and evil. She also said, in spite of what happened to me during the war, I have no feelings of bitterness or hate. But on the other hand, I do not believe in the goodness of man. So I asked her what that meant, because it seemed to me to not believe in the goodness of man. I don't think she meant it in a negative way. I think she meant it, God gave us free will. We all have a choice every day between good and evil, between embracing love and forgiveness and hate. And we can't assume ever that we reach the right conclusion or that we default to the right outcome. And so we have to watch ourselves continuously. There's an obligation for people of goodwill to always speak up and to not be silent. Eva's rejoined us. I don't know, Eva, if you have closing remarks. I was trying to capture a little bit of the spirit of our conversation over the weekend. But if you have some final words of wisdom for us, just seeing everything that's happening in the world today, what would you say to us? What message would you leave us with?
Well, as we say, we can be good or we can be bad. I think this terrible thing what has happened now again with the virus, I think that teaches people that we have to become more humane and think about each other. I think perhaps it was a punishment from God that wake up, the world is going in the wrong direction. And I must say, I have, because I'm so old, I have special, I'm not allowed to mix with people and so on. And I have had so many strangers helping me, bringing me food, asking all the time if I need anything, if I need help, if I'm all right. Really, I think if times are bad, people stick more together than when time is good. And we must learn that even if the time is good, that we are going to be helpful and decent and care for each other. So I have great hope that eventually the world is going to learn to be decent people and think about each other and not be so selfish, as unfortunately there are still in many instances. So let's stay optimistic that things is going to end eventually in a good way. Thank you. Thank
you so much.
Okay, at this moment, we would like to take the opportunity on behalf of all our viewers and the Center for Jewish Life and Osvaldo to wish you, Eva, a much success in your mission and purpose in life. You know, A lot of young people today, don't have that sense of mission and purpose, but you certainly do. And I know you've traveled the world, traveled more frequently, more often than many business leaders, to tell your story. And I think your story is incredibly important to give a sense of right and wrong, to give a sense of purpose, to instill values in a generation, in a young generation, that have lost values, unfortunately. So may you continue being the inspiration that you have been for many years, and may God give you the strength and the courage and the wisdom to continue sharing the story and spreading that light. You know, we Jews are a light unto the nations. The world's gone very dark, very confused. We need that light more than ever, and you are a beacon of that light. And may you continue to spread that light, please God, once this pandemic is over, either virtually or physically. I know you like to travel. We thank you again for being with us tonight, and we wish you health, most importantly to you, and lots of nachas, pride, happiness from all your children and grandchildren. I want to thank again Osvaldo for doing a tremendous job in preparing this interview and probing questions he has asked and bringing out the best in this incredible story. Finally, I just want to say that there are many other events that we're hosting on Facebook. Next week, Wednesday, we have a fireside chat with Maurice Levy, the chairman of Publicis. We also, the following week, we have an opportunity, a Q&A with one of America's greatest relationship gurus. We also have a leadership series involving former head of the Southern Command, Ronald Mogg, former head of the Air Force, Eliezer Shkeli, and Francois Pinard, the captain of that famous South African team that won the Rugby World Cup. Again, on behalf of the CJL, I want to thank all our viewers here tonight, and especially to Eva and to Osvaldo for joining us. We thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. And remember, stay healthy, stay safe, and most important, stay positive.